This is Lecture 2, the Functional Anatomy of the Nervous System. Note we are going to cover sections 2.1 through 2.5, and we're not going to be covering section 2.6. Some reminders and announcements, in case you skip the title page, don't read section 2.6. And then make sure you check out the updated syllabus, which is under the Resources tab on Lau Lima. Based on the responses from the homework of last week, a number of people are interested in careers in psychology in this class, so I just wanted to bring your attention to some resources that you have at UH Manoa. The Psychology Undergraduate Advising Office is really great, and it's run by two graduate students who I know, and I know them personally, and I've worked with them, and they're really great people who are very motivated to help people figure out if a psychology career is a good move for them. Selena is in cultural and community psychology, but she can advise anyone that's interested in any sub-area of psychology, and Caitlin is in clinical psychology, so if you're interested in clinical, it'd be particularly good to talk to Caitlin. They're located in Sakamaki, D409, which is in the top floor of Sakamaki. Take a ride at the elevator. You can call, you can, I think you can email and make an appointment if you like, and they also have summer walk-in hours. So if you're interested in psychology as a career and you haven't contacted them yet, I highly recommend that you do this. These are some recommended materials. They're not at all required, just in case you are interested in kind of some more like pop psychology or psychology written for non-experts. Radiolab is one of my favorite podcasts. It's an NPR podcast that a lot of times covers psychology and neuroscience related topics, but certainly not every week. Hidden Brain is a newer podcast that's really popular, and they always cover psychology and neuroscience related topics. And then if you are really a nerd and like original source articles, so like journal articles, Nature Neuroscience is put out by a very high impact journal called Nature Neuroscience, and they just kind of give you an update on recently published articles, so maybe a couple minutes on each of the recently updated articles. A number of you had also noted that you were interested in travel and other cultures, and I saw an opportunity to bring up a potential travel spot if anyone's interested. So I recently went to Ethiopia for a couple days this past winter and was able to see the remains of some of the earliest hominid skeletons, some of the earliest hominid remains ever, and I highly recommend it for anyone who's interested in travel and also interested in early hominid development. It's really profound and fascinating to see some of these skeletons that are millions of years old. So one that's there in Addis Ababa, which is the capital of Ethiopia, is Ardi, and Ardi is 4.4 million years old. She is the most complete early hominid skeleton that's ever been found. And she walked upright, but she had feet that could grasp tree branches. So you can see on the far right, this is a artistic rendering of what she might have looked like. And then this is a picture, I'm sorry, it's a rather poor quality, but just a picture I took of her remains in Ethiopia. And then Lucy, I think, might be a little bit more famous. She's also there. She was found in Ethiopia as well, and she's in this museum in Addis Ababa. She's also called Dinkinesh, which means you are wonderful, in Amharic, which is the local language in Ethiopia. She's 3.2 million years old, so a little bit newer than Ardi. She was found before Ardi, so I think she gained a lot of fame for being the oldest mostly complete hominid skeleton found at that time. And I found it interesting as well that she was likely just 12 years old when she died, which was considered a mature young adult at that time. So she also walked upright. You can see her feet are a little more human, a little closer to Homo sapien than Ardi, and you can tell maybe from her skeleton. So this is, on the left, this is her, the remains that were found, and then on the right, this is kind of they filled in the gaps with plastic to show what a complete skeleton might have looked like of Lucy. But you can see that she looks a little bit more human than Artie seemed to have. So if you're interested in travel, Addis Ababa is very fascinating in general. Ethiopia is an amazing place that it's not too touristy if you like non-touristy places, and if you're interested in early human evolution, or early hominid evolution at least, it's a really fascinating place to go. Section 2.1, this is an overview of brain function and structure. One of the most basic and important aspects of brain function and structure is neuroplasticity, which is the ability of the nervous system to change both chemically and physically to adapt to the environment and compensate for injury. Neuroplasticity has a very broad meaning. Learning is dependent on neuroplasticity. Pretty much all of our basic cognitive and emotional functions are rooted in the ability of the nervous system to change in relation to the environment. The functional organization of the nervous system, I apologize for the figures. Usually they provide the figures in the book. This time I just had to take a picture. But I really like how they give you both the anatomical organization and the functional organization of the nervous system within your book. So the anatomical organization is the more traditional conceptualization of our nervous system. This is what I learned when I was in intro to psychobiology in undergrad. And in this, the nervous system is comprised of the central nervous system and the peripheral nervous system. And within the CNS, you have the brain and the spinal cord. And within the PNS, you have the somatic, autonomic, and enteric nervous system. The functional organization is more functional. It relates more to how the nervous system actually functions. And I think it's kind of a better and more updated version of the organization of the nervous system. So here you have the CNS and then all the parts of the peripheral nervous system kind of on the same level. And in the somatic nervous system, this breaks down into cranial and spinal nerves. Autonomic breaks down into sympathetic and parasympathetic. And then the enteric is it doesn't have any subdivisions, at least at this point. So the central nervous system is what we usually think of as the human nervous system. This includes the brain and the spinal cord, and this mediates behavior. So this is responsible for most of our higher level behaviors. The somatic nervous system includes the spinal and cranial nerves. So this transmits sensory information from the body to the central nervous system. This comes from muscles, joints, and skin. So this is like the what we think of as like our sensory organs and sensory systems. And the CNS transmits motor instructions to the somatic nervous system to control movement. The autonomic nervous system regulates the functions of the internal organs and the glands. So if you've heard of the fight or flight response, this happens through the sympathetic nerves. This is like an arousal system. And then conversely, the rest and digest response is the opposite of fight or flight. And this is through the parasympathetic nervous system. And this is like a calming response. So these two, parasympathetic and sympathetic, kind of act together to balance out arousal and then more calming mechanisms. And then the enteric nervous system controls the gut. So this, if you hear about like gut bacteria and how this relates to behavior, this is kind of a hot topic in science, and you see it reported in the media. When the media reports on science, you hear this once in a while. The enteric nervous system is kind of a mesh of neurons that are in the lining of the gut, so in the stomach and the digestive system, that runs from the esophagus to the colon. And this is mostly responsible for digesting food into nutrients, of course, but it actually has a lot of interplay with the central nervous system, and we will go over that in more detail in a bit. Okay, finding your way around the brain. So this is just directions in the brain. So these are important to know because you'll hear terms like dorsolateral prefrontal cortex, and you want to know what that means. You want to know what dorsal means and what lateral is, where you might find that area of the brain. So anterior, posterior, and rostral-caudal mean essentially the same thing. Anterior means the front, posterior means the back, same with rostral-caudal. And then dorsal and ventral mean pretty much the same as superior, inferior. Dorsal means on the back, so if you think of like a dolphin has its dorsal fin on the back of its body, that's dorsal means back, and ventral means like the belly or the bottom. And then medial lateral. Medial is the middle, going toward the middle of the brain, and lateral means toward the outside of the brain. Especially in neuroimaging, we also talk about 3 different planes of the brain, 3 different ways you can kind of slice the brain for images in fMRI, for example. There's the coronal plane, which essentially goes dorsal to ventral. The horizontal plane goes from anterior to posterior, and the sagittal plane cuts the hemispheres, the right and the left hemispheres, from each other. So we have a few structures that protect the brain from damage. These include the meninges. This is 3 layers of tissue. It's the dura mater, the arachnoid matter, and pia mater. And then we have cerebral spinal fluid, or CSF, which is a clear solution, mostly comprised of sodium chloride and other salts. The ventricles, which are holes, holes that don't have gray matter or white matter in the brain, in the forebrain. These are filled with cerebral spinal fluid, and CSF also circulates around in the brain and the spinal cord beneath that arachnoid layer to cushion the brain, and also provides some kind of cleaning and healing functions for those areas of the brain. Most of you might remember from Psych 100, or if you took AP Psychology in high school, there are 4 main lobes of the brain. These lobes are present on both the right and the left side. The temporal lobe is this orange one in the figure. It's responsible for hearing, language, music, memory functions as well. So there's an interior part or a medial part of the temporal lobe that plays a large part in memory. The frontal lobe is the one in the front. It's the largest lobe, and this one's responsible for executive functions, which are higher level cognitive functions like decision making. And then the parietal lobe, which is this green one, up kind of on the top of your head, and this is responsible for spatial orientation, integrating sensory information, and a number of other functions as well. And then the occipital lobe is actually responsible pretty much exclusively for vision. So vision is a very prominent sensory process in humans and in most animals, and so we have a lobe of the brain responsible just for vision. The cerebral cortex, which we also call the neocortex, is this outer part of the brain. It's thin, it's folded into gyri and sulci, and it's comprised of the bodies of neurons. If you look at these pictures on the right, it's the darker part on the top of the brain, on the outer part of the brain. We also call it gray matter. And the neocortex is responsible for higher order nervous system tasks. So the thickness of the neocortex often corresponds to how good the brain is at these functions, even looking between individuals. So in anatomical MRI research, when we image the brain, just the brain structures, sometimes, for example, IQ might be correlated with the thickness of the neocortex in an individual in certain areas of the brain. There's also white matter, which is literally this lighter kind of white looking or maybe light gray looking substance in the more middle part of the brain or underneath the neocortex. And this contains mostly the neuronal axons. Ventricles, as I mentioned just earlier, are these cavities or holes in the brain. They contain CSF. They help cushion the brain. They maintain metabolism, just kind of help with kind of the upkeep and health of the rest of the brain. The corpus callosum are bands of white matter that connect the left and the right cerebral hemispheres. And it's kind of a striking structure that's just has all these white matter tracks running through it. It allows communication between the hemispheres and contains approximately 200 million nerve fibers. So white matter is responsible for communication between neurons. White matter, as we talk about individual neurons later, it's the axon or the kind of connecting strands of the neurons. So this part of the brain, white matter, is responsible for helping brain areas communicate with each other, and is actually more and more we're coming to learn that white matter is actually very important for the integrity of a lot of cognitive and sensory functions. Before, gray matter was kind of what most scientists focused on. Like I mentioned before, the thickness of the gray matter and whether gray matter is activated in certain tasks. But kind of maybe in the past 10 to 15 years, we've realized that white matter is extremely important as well. Severing the corpus callosum or cutting it surgically can cause an interesting disorder called split brain syndrome. It's rare that this is done, and it's usually a last resort when someone with epilepsy has not responded to other treatments. But effectively, when the corpus callosum is cut, this is the only connection point between the two hemispheres, so it creates two brains, the left hemisphere and the right hemisphere, no longer communicate on intentions, thoughts, perceptions. So information is coming into the brain separately, and ideas and cognitions that are being formed in the separate hemispheres are also not being transferred to the other hemisphere. And the behavioral correlates of this are that a patient can kind of have different intentions, or sort of has two different personalities almost on the different sides of the body. So a patient might button her shirt with one hand and unbutton the shirt with the other hand. One side of the brain wants to wear the shirt, the other side doesn't. If a patient has their eyes closed and they're handed an object in their left hand, and therefore have no visual input in the right field, they're not able to say out loud what this object was. And this is because certain functions such as language are lateralized, which means they're predominantly processed on one side of the brain. And so the language side of the brain is on the right side. And if someone is handed an object on the left side, the percepts that from the left side of the brain can't get to the language side of the brain. If you're interested, there are some videos of split brain patients here, and there's actually quite a bit more on the internet in general. So if you're particularly interested in split brain patients, let me know and I can give you more information. The brain is made up of cells and fibers. So nuclei are groups of cells that are clustered together, cells being neurons in the brain for the most part. Nuclei are groups of cells that are clustered together and they form like a functional group. Nerves are large collections of axons, which we'll get to, but axons are branches that come out from the cell body that communicate information to other cells. And so a nerve is a large collection of this that run together outside of the central nervous system. And then a tract is the same thing, but it's inside the nervous system. Neurons are obviously vitally important to the major functions of the brain. Glial cells, on the other hand, are kind of, we consider them to be like supportive cells. They're sort of cells that surround neurons, kind of create structure and framework for the brain. And we used to think of them just as purely supportive cells, but we're also finding out that they do quite a bit of modulating neuronal activity, so they can actually be rather important in the function of a neuron. And if you look at this picture down on the right-hand side, on the left-hand side at the bottom, the glial cells are the big red ones, and you can see they kind of, this particular type of glial cell creates sort of a structure that the neurons can kind of weave in between, so they create a bit of a framework for the neurons to grow upon. For Section 2, Evolutionary Development of the Nervous System, I want you to remember two main points. The first is that almost all the behaviors such as that we're going to talk about in this course, such as like motor behavior, emotional behavior, motivated behavior, they actually require interaction between many different areas of the brain. And the more complex the behavior, the more area of the brain or areas of the brain that are typically recruited for that action. A lot of times as scientists we talk in simple language, such as like this is the auditory area of the brain, this is the visual area of the brain, etc. But this is just kind of a simplified way of talking about it. There are parts of the brain that are mostly required for certain actions and behaviors, but almost everything requires a recruitment of many areas throughout the brain. The second is that while we associate vertebrates with more intelligent behavior, and this is generally true, there are some invertebrates that have shown to have something like intelligent behavior in rather complex nervous systems, although their nervous systems might look different from ours. So an octopus, for example, doesn't necessarily have a centralized nervous system, doesn't have a CNS like we do. Rather, their nervous system is distributed throughout their body, especially in the tentacles. However, they show really complex behavior. So, for example, you can watch this video on YouTube where an octopus shows observational learning, where one learns to solve a puzzle or solve a task by watching somebody else do it. So the octopus learns by watching another octopus solve a task to obtain a treat. And this is considered to be rather complex behavior, watching someone else solve a puzzle. Section 3, the central nervous system and how it mediates behavior. So going back to the central nervous system, we have the spinal cord, which is a bundle of nerve tissues and supporting cells that go from the brainstem, which is that little stem at the bottom, at the sort of bottom of the forebrain, to the lumbar region, all the way down. Each spinal segment is responsible for a different part of the body, as you can see in the top right figure. The brainstem, which is on the top of the spinal cord, is the central structure of the brain, sits in the center, and is responsible for most of our unconscious behavior. It's we talk about it as the oldest part of the brain, so old in an evolutionary sense. It's one of the first parts. It is rather the first part of the brain that evolved, and it's a part of the brain that the brainstem is a part of the brain that pretty much every organism with a central nervous system has. The brainstem includes the hindbrain, the midbrain, the diencephalon, and the cerebellum, with the hindbrain and the midbrain being essentially extensions of the spinal cord. So they serve similar functions. The hindbrain is the oldest part of the brain. These structures are responsible for most of our involuntary and voluntary movement. So movement's a really basic process. It's one of the first things that animals evolved to do, and therefore the old part of the brain is responsible for this. It includes the pons, the medulla, the reticular formation, and the cerebellum, although notably some conceptualizations of the hindbrain don't include the cerebellum. You'll notice if you go on to study more psychobiology that a lot of times the divisions of the structures of the brain are conceptualized differently just depending on who you're talking to. So please keep that in mind if you do intend to study psychobiology or go into a field where psychobiology is used, that different people conceptualize these structures differently. But anyway, so the cerebellum is that little like tiny brain in the back of the brain, and it controls balance, coordinated movement, and actually a number of other functions. We'll get into it later, but people are finding out more and more that the cerebellum plays a role in emotion and maybe even higher cognitive processes. The reticular formation in the middle there mediates sleep-wake behavior. and behavioral arousal, so being alert. The pons and medulla control body movement. The pons connects the cerebellum to the rest of the brain, so the cerebellum has a lot of connections to the cerebral cortex, the neocortex, and the pons mediates this. And the medulla controls breathing and cardiovascular system, so really important. You can imagine if any of these areas, especially the medulla, was damaged, that this could be fatal, as it's responsible for breathing and mediation of cardiovascular systems such as the heart. Okay, the midbrain, as its name suggests, is the central part of the brain. It contains neural circuits that mediate hearing, seeing, and orienting movements. Orienting movements being movements of the brain, movements of the head and the body that orient the sensory organs toward the source of a sound or a sight. So if you're walking down the street and you hear a car honking, you might turn your head to see what's going on, and that would be an orienting movement. The tectum is a sensory component of the midbrain, and it contains the superior colliculus, which receives visual information, the inferior colliculus, which receives auditory information. And this is also responsible for orienting behaviors. And the tegmentum is the motor component. So this has the red nucleus, which controls limb movement, substantia nigra, which means literally black substance, which mediates reward and movement. So the substantia nigra is black because it actually contains such a dense collection of dopaminergic cells, which I guess tend to be kind of black in color or dark in color, that literally when you look at a brain post-mortem, this area of the brain is black. And it's strongly implicated in Parkinson's disease, which is a disease, motor disease that in which dopaminergic function is affected, and we'll talk about that in more detail later. And the tegmentum also plays a role in pain perception. The diencephalon literally means between the brain. It integrates sensory information and motor information on the way to the cerebral cortex. You can see as we're kind of climbing up into the neocortex, the functions get a little bit more complex. So the diencephalon includes the thalamus, which integrates information from all sensory systems and then projects it into the cerebral cortex. So all of the sight and sound and all the sensory information that's coming from the body goes through the thalamus, and the thalamus sort of decides where in the cerebral cortex that information is going to go. It's also called, or it's often called the switchboard for the brain, if you're familiar with like old telephone switchboards, which was like a person sitting, getting the incoming, sitting at the connection point between all telephones, getting the incoming calls and deciding where those calls were going to be transmitted to. The hypothalamus, which literally sits below the thalamus, hypo being below, contains nuclei that are associated with temperature regulation, eating, drinking, and sexual behavior. So a lot of basic functions that kind of help maintain life. And then the forebrain is the newest part of the brain in evolution. And this is the one that sort of makes us, this is the part that sort of differentiates us from a lot of other animals. Other animals have the forebrain, but we have particularly big forebrains, complex forebrains with more surface area, more neocortex, and bigger frontal areas. And the forebrain coordinates advanced functions like planning, language, kind of any of these higher cognitive functions, working memory, for example. It contains the cerebral cortex, the limbic system, and the basal ganglia. The cerebral cortex is the outer layer of the forebrain. Has 6 layers of gray matter, and each of these layers has a different function with different cytoarchitecture, meaning different types of cells and different structural configurations of cells. And this is responsible for most of the complex cognitive functions, as I mentioned before. Okay, you might sometimes see pictures of the brain like these on the right, where it's kind of divided into different sections, and sometimes there are different patterns in different sections. These are called Brodmann's areas. It's actually a really old way of organizing the areas of the brain. Brodmann looked at brains post-mortem and just noted different cytoarchitecture in different parts of the brain when he, took little slices of those parts of the brain, looked at under a microscope, and just noted structural differences in those parts of the brain. And we still use these areas today sometimes because those brains actually have functional differences, kind of underscoring the connection between the structure of the brain and how that impacts function. The basal ganglia is a collection of subcortical forebrain nuclei. Subcortical meaning literally below the cortex. It's in the inside part of the brain. It's responsible for coordinating and controlling voluntary movement of the body. Has connections to the thalamus and the midbrain. So as I mentioned before, the thalamus is kind of the switchboard for the brain. It's getting a lot of sensory information coming in, and then the thalamus is informing the basal ganglia what movement and reactions are needed to interact with the environment. The basal ganglia include the caudate nucleus, putamen, and globus pallidus. The limbic system is kind of the emotion center of the brain. It's involved in affective, which means emotional and motivated behaviors, as well as sometimes of memory, especially emotional memory and autobiographical memories, a memory of things that have happened throughout a person's life. It includes the cingulate cortex, which is this band of cortex that goes around the corpus callosum, which is responsible for error detection, emotion regulation, impulse control. The amygdala, which literally means almond because it's shaped like a little almond, is responsible for emotional memory, fear, and the intensity of emotions. The hippocampus, which means seahorse, actually, because it kind of looks like a little seahorse, is responsible for memory, and there are other structures as well in the limbic system. The limbic system especially is one of those systems that different people conceptualize different structures to be included in it. So these are the main structures, but certainly people consider, for example, the olfactory system to be part of the limbic system. And some people even consider parts of the frontal cortex to be part of the limbic system. But for now, maybe just remember the main structures. So section 4, somatic nervous system, transmitting information. The cranial nerves of within the brain each have a different function. So they control sensory and motor functions in the head, neck, and internal organs. There are 12 pairs of them, with one nerve of each pair controlling the right and one controlling the left hemisphere of the brain. So they kind of have matching sides on each hemisphere. The spinal nerves go through the vertebrae, run through the middle of their vertebrae. The vertebrae are bones that form the spinal column and kind of protect the spinal nerves and also keep the body upright. The spinal cord has 5 groups of segments, so kind of groups of nerves that are responsible for different areas of the body. There's the cervical, thoracic, lumbar, sacral, and coccygeal. Each spinal cord segment corresponds to a dermatome, which is a segment of the body, the part of the body that spinal cord, that the nerves in that spinal cord are responsible for. Spinal nerves on the left side of the body, spinal nerves on the left side of the spine control the left side of the body. Nerves on the right side of the spine control the right side of the body, and this is considered an ipsilateral configuration, literally meaning same side. So nerves on that side of the body control it. This is in contrast to contralateral. Afferent nerves are those that carry information from the sensory receptors in the body to the spinal cord and then up to the central nervous system. Efferent nerves carry information from the spinal cord to the muscles. So afferent is information coming in to the central nervous system. Efferent is information going out to the body. And these are terms that you're going to encounter a couple of times throughout this course, so best to really be familiar with these terms. Afferent nerve fibers gather as they enter the spinal cord, and this forms the posterior root ganglion. And efferent nerves gather as they exit the spinal cord and form the anterior root ganglion. So if you remember posterior and anterior being front, more frontward, and posterior being in the back. The autonomic nervous system and the enteric nervous system work together to control the internal organs. The ANS contains the sympathetic nervous system and the parasympathetic nervous system, which, if you remember from earlier, kind of act in opposition to each other to balance out the arousal of the body. So sympathetic nervous system arouses the body to action, including the fight or flight response, where if a person encounters a stressor, so if you're walking in the woods and you see a bear, your sympathetic nervous system spikes, it's very active, and the fight or flight response is you either fight the bear or you run away. The correlates of this sympathetic nervous system arousal are increased heart rate, increased blood pressure, whereas the parasympathetic nervous system calms the body down. So this when there aren't any stressors in the environment or when a person has been awake for a long time and it's time to just rest. The heart rate slows, blood pressure slows, digestion is stimulated, and this is called the rest and digest response. ANS connections are also ipsilateral, meaning on the same side of the body. And the ganglia control organs as well. The ganglia serve as like mini brains for each organ, transmitting information to each organ. The enteric nervous system, which is essentially the gut, controls waste elimination, secretion, blood flow that mediates nutrition and fluid absorption. It's sometimes considered part of the ANS, but it functions rather independently. So we're going to consider it to be a different nervous system. And it has approximately the same number of neurons as the spinal cord, which is quite a few neurons. So previous conceptualizations, as I think I mentioned before, of the nervous system didn't always include the enteric nervous system, but it's becoming quite clear that the gut really should be considered part of the nervous system. In the ENS, you're going to find a lot of what you would find in the brain or in other neurotransmitter systems. So different types of neurons, different types of glial cells. You'll find neurotransmitters like serotonin. The neurons are located in what's called the plexus, which is a tissue lining of the digestive system. And modification of the brain and the gut goes both ways. So the brain can change the action of the gut, and the gut can change the action of the brain. For example, there are psychological conditions such as anxiety that lead to gut problems like nausea and diarrhea. In fact, when we, as clinical psychologists, when we're assessing for panic disorder, we explicitly ask if somebody has diarrhea or an upset stomach during what we think might be a panic attack because of this really close relationship between high levels of psychological anxiety and problems with the gut. The gut can also create psychological issues, or at least contribute to psychological issues such as depression. So if somebody's not absorbing nutrients properly, this can lead to depressive symptoms and other psychological symptoms. There's also research indicating that other serious mental illness like schizophrenia and autism may be influenced by early gut bacteria. This is pretty preliminary research and shouldn't be overinterpreted, but it is kind of promising and speaks to the importance of the ENS. If you're interested, there's a story from NPR with a video on the microbiome. The microbiome is just gut bacteria and how it might influence our minds. Okay, in section 6, I mentioned you don't have to read. Don't worry about that. All right, that's it for this chapter.